Yali Madat, everybody. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes. Thanks and a very warm welcome once again to all our participants. And it's so good to see so many people, familiar names now. So I'm glad to see that you keep coming back for each webinar, which means you are appreciating the content and immensely grateful to you for that. Once again, a very warm welcome to everybody, and this is the final series, the final part of our 4-part series on studying in Canada. And we started in April, early April, when we were, I think, bearing the brunt of the pandemic and facing the worst of it. We had the first session on studies in Canada. Then early May, we followed it up with a session on financing options in Canada. The third session was by Ziah Sumar, which was on uh, the options for students who want to pursue their studies abroad. And today, this is the last session where we bring it all together. And once again, I want to give a very heartfelt thank you and immense gratitude to Education Board for Canada and to Nahida and Nahida Husseinzada and Anushka Jafar from the AKEB Canada team. Thank you so much for your support and your guidance throughout. It's been a wonderful journey. And I'll just like to quickly introduce our speaker for today. The speaker for today is known to all of you. She also took the last session, which a lot of you shared a lot of positive feedback. So we have Ziah Sumar with us today, who is a Canadian immigration lawyer, barrister, and solicitor, and a partner working with Long Mangalji LLP. And she's got amazing credentials. She specializes in providing immigration and planning strategies to large MNCs and corporations, as well as the small and medium enterprise sector. She's conducted a lot of informational presentations on immigration programs, and she's been invited to present all across Canada and United States. She's also an active member for Canada's legal and immigration communities. She's also a part of, she's a citizenship and immigration lead and subject matter expert for the settlement portfolio for the Ismaili Council for Ontario and National Settlement Portfolio for the Ismaili Council for Canada. She's also an executive committee member of the Citizenship and Immigration section of the Ontario Bar Association. So Ziah, once again, thank you very much for giving us your time and sharing your inputs. And the floor is yours, Ziah. Looking forward to the next 60 minutes of information from you.
Thank you so much. And yeah, everyone, thank you for having me. So in our last session, we talked about applying for the study permit. Today, what we're going to focus on is once you're here, looking at the options then to move from temporary residence to permanent residence, right? So looking at the process of applying for permanent residence. So again, just to give you some context, we'll start with an overview, okay? So when we're talking about status in Canada, there's 3 types of statuses. You have your temporary residence, which encompasses your visitors, your students, and individuals who hold a work permit. From temporary residence, then from there we have permanent residence, okay? And that's where we're going to be focusing on today. So the options of applying for your permanent residence. After permanent residence, the last type of status here in Canada is, of course, citizenship, okay? So let's jump right in. When we're talking about permanent residence, before we get into the options of applying, it's really important to understand some very basic concepts. And the one big one is the difference between high and low skilled occupations. Okay, so whenever we're looking at permanent residence criteria and eligibility, we're always differentiating between high skilled and low skilled work. So I thought this would be a good place to start. So in theory, immigration has classified all occupations into high and low skilled positions. Okay, and so what we're saying here is that theoretically, again, immigration has said, okay, we have all these different occupations that people can potentially work in, and we have codified them. Okay, so whenever you're looking at applying or whenever you're looking at jobs, you want to understand where that's going to fall in for the immigration, because that will determine how you're able to use it to then apply later for your permanent residence. So we have a website, okay? IRCC has a website that has this national occupation classification system in it. When you're looking at that website, you want to review the lead statement and the main duties that are outlined in the occupation code to determine whether or not you fit into that particular position. And we'll take a look at it together. NOC O, A, and B are considered high skilled, whereas NOC C and D are considered low skilled. So let's take a look at the website. So when we go online on the Government of Canada website and we search for National Occupation Classification System, this is the main page that we get. From here, there's two ways that you can search your occupation, right? So let's say I'm working as an admin assistant, an administrative assistant. There's two ways that I can look up where that falls in. I can either go into the structure. Basically, they have listed out all the occupations and try and find the one that best suits my position, or I can use the search button. Okay, on the search button, you would basically put in a title and it would come up with different potential options. So I've gone in, I've put in administrative assistant, and this is the page that comes up. Okay, now looking at this, if you remember from a couple slides back, we said you want to review the lead statement and you want to review the main duties. Well, this top part here is the main statement. So it's a short paragraph that gives an overview of what the position is. Okay, don't be too concerned about the titles, the position titles that you see listed there. You want to focus on the lead statement and the main duties. Okay, so this small paragraph here should give you an overall description of your position and what you're doing. And then if we scroll down, we see these main duties listed here. Now, not all positions you're going to be performing all of the duties listed here, and that's okay. Okay, so you want to make sure that you're performing a majority, right? So when you're reviewing these main duties, in order for you to say, yes, this is the right occupation, this is where I fall, you have to be performing the majority of the main duties that are listed in the occupation code. Now, let's say I've gone through that, I've read the lead statement, I've read the main duties, and I said, yes, this is exactly it. This is my position. Well, then I want to know, is this high skilled? Is it low skilled? So we go back up here, and at the top, there's a bit of a summary, and it gives you the skill level. Okay, so if you remember, we said that NOC O, A, and B are considered high skilled, and NOC C and D are low skilled. So the administrative assistant position, I've gone through it. I said, yes, this is exactly my position. This is what I do. I went back up to the skill level, and it tells me it's skill level B, so it's considered a high skilled position. Okay, so this is an example. Administrative assistant would be an example of a high skilled role. Great. So now that we know that, let's talk about the actual programs themselves. When we're looking at the process of obtaining permanent residence, there's really three main classifications for the various programs. You have family class, economic class, and refugee class. Okay, so family class, we're focusing on a particular relationship. Okay, so we're looking at demonstrating that it's a genuine relationship. Now, there's only certain relationships through which we can apply for permanent residence. So we can apply to sponsor our spouses, our parents or grandparents, or our dependent children. Okay, so unfortunately, there's no sponsorship under the family class for siblings or for aunts and uncles. It's a question I get all the time. Unfortunately, the family class is limited in terms of who we can sponsor. Refugee class, on the other hand, is for individuals that are looking, that are able to demonstrate that they fall under the definition of a refugee. So they are fearing for persecution for their life in their country of citizenship. And so today, those are not going to be the two focuses that we're going to talk about. We're going to focus on the economic class. And in the economic class, we're focusing on an individual's background, so the applicant's background. We're looking at their education, their work experience, their language proficiencies. We're really looking at the principal applicant's background in order to qualify and apply for permanent residence. Now, many different options in these programs, okay? Many different ways to apply for permanent residence, specifically even just within the economic class. So we're going to look at a couple of the more popular ways to apply. And we're going to start with some of the most popular federal programs. So the Canadian Experience Class, the Federal Skilled Worker, and the Federal Skilled Trades programs. Now, when we're talking about applying for permanent residence and we say federal programs, what do I mean by that? Well, when we're looking at applying for permanent residence, there are federal and there are provincial programs. Federal mean programs that are Canada-wide, except for in Quebec. Okay, so Quebec is the only exception to this. But when we're applying for the federal programs, we're really saying that we're applying to live anywhere in Canada outside of Quebec. Okay, so let's take a look at these federal programs. The first one is the Federal Skilled Worker Program. Now, with the Federal Skilled Worker Program, there's 5 main criteria: work experience, language, education, financial savings, and there's a rubric out of 100 on which you have to score a minimum of 67 points. Now, I want to take a look at each of these individually because it's really important to understand each of these criteria. For the work experience component, you need to have at least 1 year of continuous high-skilled work experience in a single occupation within the past 10 years. So that's a mouthful. Let's break it down. 1 year of continuous. That word continuous is really important when we're talking about the Federal Skilled Worker Program. So continuous means that there cannot be a break in your employment for that minimum duration of a year. Okay. Why is this important? Well, let's say, for example, you're working with 2 different employers. You start with company A, and then you decide to change jobs to company B. Well, if you decide to take a well-deserved break between those 2 companies, that can break your continuity. And so that would mean that your year would restart with company B. In order for you to use both company A and company B together to meet that 1 year requirement, there can't be a break in your employment. So essentially, you'd be looking to end on one day with one company and start on the next day with company B. Okay, so really important, 1 year of continuous high-skilled work experience. We talked about what high-skilled meant, right? So not O, A, or B positions. So 1 year of continuous high-skilled work experience in a single occupation. Okay, so again, when we're looking at the skilled worker program, when we're looking at the minimum criteria, you do need to be, that 1 year does need to be within a single occupation. Okay, and so I can't start as an administrative assistant, which we know is a high-skilled position, with company A, and then even if there's no break in my employment and I'm going to company B, I can't change to company B and be a lawyer, for example, because those are going to be 2 different occupation codes. Okay, so 1 year of continuous high-skilled work experience in a single occupation within the past 10 years. Now, the second requirement is language. So for the Federal Skilled Worker Program, you do need to be able to demonstrate a minimum Canadian level benchmark of 7. So when we're talking about the language test, we're either looking at the IELTS General or the CELPIP General test. For each of these, for either of these, you do need to meet the minimum Canadian level benchmark in every category. So these language tests score you on your reading, writing, speaking, and listening. And on each of them, you do have to have that minimum CLB 7. There's an education component. Now, if your education is outside of Canada, you do need to do an education assessment to demonstrate. It's basically a third-party report that says what your completed credential is equivalent to in Canada. And it does have to be, when you do that report, it has to show that it is from a recognized institution and equivalent to post-secondary education in Canada. For the financial savings, it depends on the size of your family. So the specific amount that you have to be able to show will depend on the number of applicants within your particular family. So for a single individual compared to a family of 4, it is going to be very different. Okay. And then for the 5th criteria here, there's a rubric specifically for the Federal Skilled Worker Program. And on that rubric, it's out of 100, you have to meet a minimum of 67 points. Now, in this rubric, we're looking at your age, your education, your work experience, again, your language proficiency, and what are called adaptability factors. Okay, so whether you have 67 or 87, it doesn't make a difference here. It's just a matter of meeting that minimum 67 points. So that's the Skilled Worker Program. Comparatively, we have the Canadian Experience Class program. Okay, in the Canadian Experience Class program, there's only 2 requirements. You need to have at least 1 year of high-skilled work experience that you've completed in Canada within the past 3 years. Okay, so 1 year of work experience within the past 3 years. It does have to be high-skilled. What we don't hear in this eligibility criteria is that it doesn't have to be continuous. It does not have to be in a single occupation. However, you cannot obtain this work experience while you're a full-time student, and it cannot be self-employed work experience. There's always a catch, right? So with the CEC requirements, it's 1 year of work experience within the past 3 years, still does have to be high skilled, but you can work with multiple employers, you can work in multiple different positions. It just can't be while you're a student, and you can't obtain it if you're self-employed. For the language component, the language proficiency, the specific marks that you do need, it will depend on the actual NOC that your positions fall under. So either you would need to meet CLB 5 or 7. Now, regardless, we will talk about it in a couple minutes. Well, it's still better to get a higher score, but we'll get to that in a moment. So that's the Canadian Experience Class program. The third and final program that we're going to focus for this particular federal programs is the skilled trades. Now, with the skilled trades program, it's a bit different. You need to have work experience in one of the listed trades occupations. So when we're talking about this particular program, the FST program, there are listed occupations under which you can get your work experience in. So it's not as broad as a skilled worker as the Canadian Experience Class program. We're focusing on the trades here. There is a language component. Again, it's CLB 5 for speaking and listening, and it's CLB 4 for reading and writing. So it's a bit lower there. The third criteria for the skilled trades, though, is that you need to have either a labor market impact assessment or a certificate of qualification by the province. Now, when we're talking about any of these federal programs, okay, what we've looked at so far is the eligibility criteria, so how you qualify for it. The next thing to talk about is the actual process, right? So once we've gone through these, we've looked at the eligibility, we've said, great, we're eligible, we qualify. The next question is, how do we apply? How do we use these programs? And that's where the system called Express Entry comes in. So it's really important to understand Express Entry is not a program in itself. It's the management system through which we apply for permanent residence when we're qualifying through one of the 3 federal programs that we've talked about so far. With the Express Entry system, the first thing we're doing is going online and creating a profile. So we're entering information about our background, our age, our education, our language scores. And what the system is doing is it's first ensuring that you qualify under one of the 3 federal programs. And then after it says, yes, you do qualify, it's putting you into the Express Entry pool. So this pool encompasses everyone across all 3 programs. Okay. You can, when you qualify and you go into the pool, your profile stays valid for a year. But what's really important to understand is that in the pool, you're given a score out of 1,200. So this is called the comprehensive ranking system. And so what IRCC doing is taking everybody in the pool and now ranking them. So using that score out of 1,200, everybody is ranked. So basically you're using your score and IRCC puts everybody in line based on that. What happens next is about every other week, IRCC goes into the pool and says, okay, today we're going to do a draw. So we're going to pick a top number of candidates. And if you are part of that top number, then you get what's called an invitation to apply. Okay, so what you need to understand here is that going into the Express Entry pool is basically just saying that you're interested in becoming a permanent resident. It's not actually the application for permanent residence just yet. You need to get that invitation in order to be able to prepare and actually submit your PR application. Okay, so if IRCC does a draw for the first 3,000 people, for example, they'll go from the highest scoring person to the 3,000th person and they'll set a minimum score. Everybody above that minimum score is who's receiving an invitation to apply. And once an applicant receives that invitation to apply, right now they have 90 days to prepare and submit their entire PR application. So now that we understand the process, what goes into that 1200, right? So I call it the comprehensive ranking system. Here you're using your age, your education, your language proficiency scores, your work experience, both inside and outside of Canada. We're looking at your spouse. So if you have an accompanying spouse, we're looking at their education, their language proficiency, their work experience. If you've studied in Canada already, you get additional points for that. If you're bilingual, so you speak both English and French, you get additional points for that. What you need to understand here, though, is when we're talking about the comprehensive ranking system and we're talking about the eligibility criteria, these are two very different things, right? We first focused on the eligibility criteria and we said that your minimum eligibility in order to qualify under the skilled worker program, for example, was a Canadian level benchmark of 7 in all aspects of your English test. But in the CRS system, in the comprehensive ranking system, when we're looking at your points in the pool, really important to understand that each of those language proficiency categories, so your reading, your writing, your speaking, listening, all of that is going to have an impact. So generally, it's not sufficient to just get the minimum language. You want to score higher than that because that's going to affect your overall points in Express Entry, right? And that may actually be your determining factor as to whether or not you get an invitation and are able to apply for permanent residence. So that's the Express Entry system in a nutshell, okay? What we're going to focus on next is the provincial nominee programs, okay? Because Express Entry is not going to be for everyone, right? We're looking at, when we talk about Express Entry, like we said, it's a points-based system. And so really we're focusing on certain individuals with the highest scoring points. And so that's not going to be the option for everyone, right? So we do want to look at alternatives as well. The provincial nominee programs is another way to apply for permanent residence. Now, when we're talking about the provincial nominee programs, basically immigration is federal jurisdiction. So it's the federal government that gets to grant permanent residence. However, what the federal government has done is that, okay, provinces will allow you to create specific programs that are tailored to address the needs of your particular province. So anytime we're talking about the provincial nominee programs, we're always looking at a multiple step route to permanent residence. You'd first be looking at the province, applying to the province, and then once you get a nomination certificate from the province, you're then applying for permanent residence again to IRCC. Okay, so it's always going to be multiple steps whenever we're talking about the P&Ps. The second thing to know is that with P&Ps, every province is different. Okay, there are certain common factors or common eligibility criteria, or common programs between the different provinces, but in the end, every province has created programs that are tailored to meet their specific needs. Okay, and when we're talking about applying to the provincial programs, you do have to have an intent to live and work in that province, right? So through the P&Ps, provinces are trying to boost their immigration. And so whenever they're looking at candidates, they want to ensure that candidates will, in the end, not just apply to them, but actually do have an intent to live and work in that province afterwards as well. Every year, every province is given a certain number of nominations that they can issue in that calendar year. Okay, so it's not an unlimited amount, which is why they're very particular in who they issue nominations to. Okay, and then on top of it, like I said before, there are different programs for each province. But one way that we can break it down and look at it very generally, because we cannot possibly cover all the different provincial programs today, but one way that we can kind of look at it from a very high level is comparing express entry versus non-express entry provincial nominee programs. Now, depending on the province, like I said, we're not going to go through all the different programs today, but depending on the province, some of them do actually include programs for low-skilled positions. So let's delve a little deeper into express entry versus non-express entry. When we're looking at the provincial programs, okay, one way to classify them is looking at the programs that fall under Express Entry and those that are separate from the Express Entry system entirely. Whenever you're looking at a program that works with Express Entry, your first step is going to be qualifying in one of the 3 federal programs that we talked about earlier, right? So the skilled worker, federal skilled trades, or Canadian experience class. On top of that, after you've looked at the eligibility criteria for the federal programs, you're eligible, you're in the Express Entry pool, the next thing is to look at the additional program criteria for the province, right? So if you remember, we said that whenever we're talking about the provincial programs, the province has created additional criteria, right, that is specific to their particular needs. And so with the Express Entry streams, you're now looking at 2 sets of criteria. You're looking at the federal criteria for skilled worker, skilled trades, or Canadian experience class. And then on top of it, you're also looking at the province's criteria for that Express Entry stream that they've created. Once you've applied to the province, you've gotten your nomination, so they've approved you, what ends up happening at that point is you get an additional 600 points in the Express Entry pool. Now, to give you some context, in Express Entry, IRCC has been doing draws. Well, before COVID, the draws were about 460, 470. And so getting an additional 600 points in the Express Entry pool would basically mean that you're guaranteed to get your invitation to apply for permanent residence. Okay, and so once you get your invitation, you prepare, you submit your PR application, and the processing time for all Express Entry applications is supposed to be 6 months. Of course, with COVID, that has increased a bit, but if we're talking about non-COVID times, that processing time is supposed to be 6 months. Okay. Comparatively, if we're looking at the non-Express Entry routes, so now we do not need to worry about qualifying under one of those 3 federal programs. You only have to worry about qualifying and meeting the eligibility criteria for that specific provincial program that you're looking to apply through. Okay, and this is where, if you're talking about if your work experience is in a low-skilled position, this is where you would fall under. Because if you remember, when we talked about the Express Entry criteria, we said that your work experience had to be in a high-skilled position, right? So the non-Express Entry routes would be where where provinces have included individuals with low-skilled work experience. Okay. The biggest difference with the non-Express Entry routes is the timelines. So yes, it's still a multiple stage process. Yes, you still have to apply to the province first. You get your nomination certificate, which means you've been approved. But after you receive that nomination certificate, you can't use it to get additional points in Express Entry. Okay, you have to actually prepare your application using IRCC's form, so going back to their older processes and mailing that application in. And so this particular route, the processing times are much longer than Express Entry, right? So with the non-Express Entry routes, your second stage, so just the permanent residence application itself, after you've received your nomination, the processing time is anywhere between 15 to 21 months, okay? So a huge difference when we're comparing it to a 6-month processing time. So that's the P&P programs, okay? Like I said, we don't have the time today to go through every single one of them, but it does, of course, depend on the province that you're interested in living in. The other big program that I want to talk about is the Rural and Northern Immigration Program. So with the Rural and Northern Immigration Program, it is specifically, the program specifically outlines the communities in which this program will apply for. So in the different provinces, they're looking at cities, they're looking at communities that are generally smaller, that are more northern, so they're not as populated. So for example, in Ontario, the RNIP program is applicable in North Bay, in Sault Ste. Marie, in Thunder Bay, in Sudbury. These are all smaller communities within the province of Ontario. The reason it's important to think about this program as well from now is because when you're thinking long-term, right, when you're looking at applying for your studies, when you're looking at coming to Canada to study, if you're applying and if you're going to be studying through one of these communities, you may want to think about also qualifying and applying through the RNIP program as well, right? So something else to think about when you're planning long-term. From now, you want to think about your permanent residence as well. The RNIP program, it's community driven. So what that means is that the participating communities are really taking the lead in driving this program for permanent residence. And it is very much based on what the needs of the community are job-wise, right? So economic-wise, when they're looking at their labor needs, when they're looking at their skill needs, this is where they're driving that through the RNIP program. So with this program, you're now looking at the eligibility criteria for both IRCC, right? So the regular immigration criteria, and you're also on top of it looking at the community's specific requirements. Again, this depends on where you're applying through, right? What community. We'll focus first on the IRCC requirement. So IRCC requires that you need to have at least 1 year continuous work experience. Okay, again, that pesky word of continuous pops up here. Or you've graduated from a qualifying program in that community. Okay, so for the RNIP, you do need to have, again, I'll focus on the students because of course you're looking to come here and study. And so we're thinking of your long-term goals here. But for students, you would need to do at least a 2-year program in that community and reside in the community for at least 16 months. Or you've completed your master's or PhD in that community and you've completed that entire program. So the master's or PhD can be shorter than the 2 years, but for that entire duration of your master's or PhD, you would have to live in the community. So the first criteria when we're talking about the RNIP, either you have a year continuous work experience or you've graduated from a qualifying program. Now, temporarily right now, IRCC has waived the continuity requirement for the RNIP program because of COVID. How long that's going to stay in place, we don't know. So, you know, it is waived at the current time. The second requirement is language. Okay, so there is a language proficiency requirement, and that's based on your job offer. Okay. Third is education. For this particular program, your minimum education, the minimum education is secondary, so high school. Okay. There's a savings component to this. Again, it's dependent on the size of your family. You see an intent to reside in the community, which basically is because we are looking at smaller communities and they are looking to retain the individuals that apply and get permanent residence through this. And then on top of these 5 criteria, we also would have to look at the community specific requirements for the particular city that you're applying through. Now, with the RNIP program, like I said, it is community driven. And so it does require an eligible job offer with an employer in the community that you're applying through. Okay. So with the RNIP, it's a great program, right? But it is really focused on looking at the specific needs of the community. So it is very much community driven. You do need to have a job offer from that community. Once you meet all these criteria, you're then applying for an endorsement from the community itself. Once you get that endorsement, then you're able to apply for your permanent residence. Okay. Another program is the Atlantic Immigration Pilot Program. Actually, this is no longer a pilot program. They've actually now made it a permanent program. But the Atlantic program, it's specific to particular provinces. Okay, so this is, yes, we've talked about the provincial nominee programs. This is on top of it. It's a separate program that's run by IRCC, but it is focused on particular provinces. So the 4 provinces that are part of the Atlantic program is New Brunswick, Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, and PEI. And again, this is something to think about. You want to look at the eligibility criteria for these programs from now, because if it is something that you qualify for, then we can look at, then you can potentially think about studying in that particular province and applying for permanent residence once you're done your program of study. So in the Atlantic program, there are 3 categories. You have your international graduate, your high skilled program, and your intermediate skilled program. Okay. All of these categories, you do need a job offer, there's language requirements, and there's a proof of funds requirement, so proof of savings requirement. With the international graduate program, you need to have completed at least a 2-year program from a public eligible institution in one of the Atlantic provinces. Okay, so we're specifically looking at someone who has studied in one of these 4 provinces and has completed at least a 2-year program. For the international graduates program, there's no work experience requirement. Okay, so as soon as you finish that program of study, you can qualify for and apply for your permanent residence. But you do need a job offer, right? So that job offer would have to be in NOC O, A, B, or C. So again, here we're seeing with the Atlantic program, there is the ability to have a job offer in a low-skilled position, a NOC C position, and still have the ability to apply for permanent residence, even with no experience, as long as you've studied in the province. The high-skilled program, as the name would suggest, you do need to have at least 1 year of high-skilled work experience. Okay. There is an education component. You do have to have the equivalent of at least a high school education, and your job offer does have to be a high skilled job offer, right? So a NOC O, A, or B position that's being offered to you in the province. The intermediate skilled program, comparatively, you still need to have a year of work experience, but it's in a NOC C position. So right away, the biggest difference we see between the high skilled and the intermediate skilled program is really focused on where or what category your work experience is in. So if it is a high skilled work experience year that you have, then you'd be applying to the high skilled program. If it's a NOC C position, then we'd be looking at the intermediate skilled program. Again, you still do need to have the equivalent of high school education, and your job offer is either NOC O, A, B, or C position. With the Atlantic program, it is still an employer-driven stream. And so what that means is when we're looking at the process of applying through the AIP program, the company that's offering you the full-time permanent position, they first need to be designated. So that employer needs to first apply to the province, get designated as an employer for this AIP program, and then once they have that designation, then you would be able to apply through the AIP stream. So once the employer has designation, then we're looking at the eligibility for the particular AIP stream, so one of the 3 categories that we just talked about, and they can make the job offer to you. The employers do need to work with you to have a settlement plan, right? So how you're particularly going to be settling in that particular province. Once all of that is done, you have the settlement plan ready, then you're able to apply with that employer and with that job offer to the province for your endorsement. Okay, so that's the first step, is getting the endorsement from the province. Once the province has approved your application, then you're able to apply for permanent residence. Okay, so again, when we're looking at the RNIP, when we're looking at the AIP, so both the rural program and this Atlantic program, they really are driven by the needs of employers and the needs of the province or the community that you're applying through, depending on the program. And it's with that job offer and with that employer that you're able to qualify and apply for your permanent residence. The last program that I want to look at is the caregiver route. Okay, so IRCC has created specific programs for individuals with a job offer as either a home childcare provider or a home support worker. Okay. Now, when we're talking about these specific caregiver programs, we're really focusing on where you have a job offer to work in someone's home as either home childcare or home support worker. Okay, so we're not looking at job offers in bigger institutions. We're talking about someone who's going into a private home and taking care of either young children under the home childcare provider program, or potentially an elderly individual or someone with medical needs under the home support worker program. Both of these streams require language proficiency. Okay, so CLB of 5. You do need to have at least a 1-year post-secondary credential. Now, again, it doesn't have to be completed in Canada, but you do have to do an education assessment to demonstrate that it is equivalent to at least a 1-year credential. The third part of this is either you need to have the work experience in Canada, so 2 years of work experience in Canada, or you need to have a job offer in either of these 2 occupations. Now, depending on whether you already have the work experience or you have a job offer, the process of applying through the caregiver stream is a little different. Okay, so with the caregiver stream, there is a work permit option. Now, for someone who was outside of Canada, let's say, and has a job offer to come and work in a particular home, taking care of children, young children, for example, because they've never been to Canada, they don't have the work experience here yet as a childcare provider. And so what IRCC is saying is, okay, you can apply to us with that job offer. Okay, you can apply demonstrating that you have the job offer. You have to be able to show that it's a genuine job offer and that you are able to work in that particular occupation, so as a home childcare provider. But you don't have to show any specific amount of experience as a home childcare provider. Do have to show that it's genuine and that you're able to work in that position, but no delineated experience required. Okay. So IRCC takes that application and says, okay, we're going to do your background check. We're going to check your admissibility. So your medical inadmissibility, or whether you're criminally admissible. If you pass both of those checks, then what we're going to do is take your PR application and put it on hold and issue you a 3-year work permit that will only allow you to work as a home childcare provider. You come, you work in that position as a home childcare provider, and then once you've finished your 2 years of experience, you provide us proof that you've completed that 2 years of experience as a childcare provider, and then we will take your PR application off of hold. Okay, so basically what that means is you're applying, you get your work permit, you finish your 2 years of experience in Canada, you provide proof, and then you're finishing your PR process. Comparatively, if you're already in Canada and have worked as a childcare provider, for example, for the 2 years, you're applying directly for your permanent residence. Okay. What's really important to understand about this program is that there is a maximum number of applications that they'll accept. So for the childcare provider program, so there are 2 different streams, right? The childcare provider and the home support worker. The childcare provider one is generally the one that we see close first. So it's already met its quota for the year for 2021. And so it'll reopen again in 2022 now. Home support worker generally stays open throughout the year. Last year it didn't close, and this year it is still open. So 2 different, very different streams, really important to check before you're applying. With the caregiver program, one of the biggest questions I get is my family going to be able to come with me? And yes, the answer is yes. So even if you're applying from outside of Canada, you don't have work experience, when you're applying for that work permit, you can have your family accompany you. Okay, so your spouse would get an open spousal work permit, and children would get either study permits or visitor records. So what do you need to do next, right? What are the next steps here? It's really important to be thinking about how you're going to apply for permanent residence right from the beginning. So like what you guys are doing right now, before you're even coming to Canada, when you're applying for your study permit, you also want to be thinking long-term in how am I going to be applying for my permanent residence as well. Okay, because you want to make sure that the steps that you're taking will always work together, right? So for example, if you don't have work experience outside of Canada, and you're going to be relying on the postgrad work permit, which we talked about in our last session, you want to make sure that the length of the postgrad work permit is sufficient in order for you to get the work experience you need to apply for permanent residence. Or if you're thinking about applying through the RNIP or the AIP program, you want to think about applying to a school, particularly in those regions, in those provinces, so that you're able to qualify for the AIP program, for example, as soon as you're done your program of study. But because you've attended today's session, not only are you thinking about the province, but you're also thinking about the length of the program, right? Because all of these play a part in your eligibility and applying for permanent residence afterwards. Okay. You want to have a plan and a backup plan, right? So that's the first thing, is thinking about how you're going to be applying and making sure that you have an alternative just in case something changes. Immigration is one of the fastest changing areas. So we talk about programs today, but whether or not they're going to be in place and whether they're still going to have the same eligibility criteria and the same processes in a year or 18 months, we don't know, right? And so it is important to be thinking about today's plan, but also to be thinking about a plan B as well. Do what you need to do to make sure that you can get there, right? So set yourself up. If it's high skilled work experience you need, start looking at what high skilled positions you would qualify for. Start thinking about applying for the positions in those particular occupations, right? Start thinking about what you need to do in order to be able to apply for permanent residence. When you're in Canada, make sure you stay in status and don't misrepresent, right? Again, we talked about this in our last session, but it is really, really important that when you're applying for any application to IRCC, right, whether it's your initial study permit, whether it's a visitor visa, whether it's your permanent residence, don't misrepresent, right? One advice that we always get, or when we're talking to clients, what we hear from them, unfortunately, is that in my study permit application, my consultant told me, hey, it's okay, just say that you've worked in this position for 5 years, or say, exclude this particular position from your application, because don't worry, this will put you in a better position when you're applying for your study permit. Maybe, but when you've now misrepresented yourself, and that can carry forward with you, and we would have to disclose that when we're applying for your permanent residence. So really be thinking about what you're putting in your application, even from that first initial study permit application that you're doing. If you do have a refusal, and it does happen, contact someone right away, contact a professional right away to talk to you about what your next steps are, because there are certain deadlines, right? You only have a certain amount of time after you get a refusal in terms of deciding what you can do, right? And what the next steps are, so that you can get either your status back if you're in Canada, or to apply again for your study permit, or to appeal that decision. And that takes us to the end. That's our PR options today. I think we'll turn it over to Q&A now. So Hill, are you still here with us?
Yes, Ziah. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes, yeah. Thanks a lot. Extremely well researched and insightful. And before we jump into the Q&A, let me just get one thing cleared. I mean, I'm getting a lot of queries on the recording for the webinar. So yes, we will be sharing the webinar recording. There is a link to a Telegram group that has been posted in the chat box. So you need to download the Telegram app and join the link. And I know a lot of you have joined later, when we have uploaded the first few webinars. So we will be uploading all 4 webinars together by in the next couple of weeks. So don't worry, you will get all the resources. And with that, we'll jump to the Q&A. And as always, the Q&A box is buzzing with a lot of questions. And I'll try to club questions so that we can answer maximum of them. We are already at 8:50, so I don't think we'll be able to answer all. But the first question is it's from an anonymous attendee. A few professions like psychology require a PhD to be recognized as a psychologist in Ontario. If I want to apply for PR under PNP immediately after my master's, do I still consider my position under NOCA? That's the question.
Okay, so that's a good question. First, it does depend on what program you're applying through. All right, so when we talk about the provincial nominee programs, there are different criteria based on the stream and the province that you're using. Now, generally, if someone, so going back to your example of a psychologist, right? If we're talking about the skilled worker program, for example, where you can use your work experience outside of Canada to qualify, it's not going to be prohibitive if you apply using your work experience, let's say in India, as a psychologist, right? You could still apply for your federal skilled worker program using that work experience in India as a psychologist, whether or not you're registered here in Ontario as a psychologist. Okay, so you don't have to be qualified to practice in the exact profession that you're using if that work experience is outside of Canada. Now, if you're trying to use the occupation of psychologist in Canada, for example, under the Canadian Experience Class program, of course, one of the questions the officer may have is whether or not you're able to practice as a psychologist, because that would lead to whether or not you have the work experience that you're claiming in your application. So it depends on the actual program and the stream that you're applying through. With the provincial nominee programs, like I said, they are all different. Specifically in Ontario, we have, because you mentioned the master's program in the question, there is a stream for master's graduates. That master's graduate stream does not have any work experience requirement, right? It's really looking at someone who has completed their master's in Canada, meets the other eligibility criteria. And so, yes, technically you could have work experience outside of Canada and still apply using that work experience.
Thanks, Zia. The next question I have is from Ayan Lalani. He's under 18. Can he go as a dependent on his elder sister's PR application? That's his question. And there are a lot
Unfortunately,
of
no.
questions. Sorry, there are a lot of questions around the PR for dependents. So I know you touched upon this, but if you could spend a few minutes clarifying this, that would be really helpful.
Of course. So when we're talking about applying for permanent residence, we have the principal applicant, right? So the person who qualifies to apply for the permanent residence. In their application, we can include a spouse, right? So someone who's their wife, their husband, their common law spouse, that's included. Included as well are dependent children. So when we talk about dependent children, we're looking at children who are under 22 years of age and are not married. Okay, that forms the family that can be that can apply together for permanent residence. So again, it's the principal applicant, their spouse, and their dependent children. Those are the only people that can be a part of one PR application. So unfortunately, siblings, parents, they're not a part of an application when you're applying through the economic classes.
Thanks, Zia. The next question is from Alpesh Paraptani. He says he has a continuous work experience of 6 years and took a break in the 7th year and joined an occupation at the end of the 7th year. So is he still eligible to apply?
Yeah, so I think where you're going with this is the federal skilled worker program. And with the federal skilled worker program, again, the minimum criteria is that 1 year of continuous work experience. It does not say that you have to have all 6 or all 7 years of your work experience has to be continuous. It's just a matter of meeting that 1 year of continuous work experience. After that point, you can have breaks in your employment, and that's completely fine. There's nothing that says that your entire career has to be continuous.
Thanks. Another question from Zenobia. In fact, there are two questions which I'll try to combine. If you get express entry from India, can we apply to Canada simultaneously for education? And while you have applied for education, can you also work there? Those are her two questions.
Okay. Yeah, so definitely you can have both a PR application, so your express entry application, at the same time that you're applying for your study permit. There's nothing technically prohibiting that, right? So there's nothing to say that, okay, IRCC won't process your study permit or won't process your PR application. With that being said, part of your study permit application, part of what the officer is looking at is whether you have the intent to return to your country of citizenship at the end of your at the end of your studies, right? And so, yes, we understand that majority of people may be thinking when they're coming here to study, their ultimate goal is to become permanent residents, and that's just the reality. But having both a PR application and a temporary residence application can sometimes be problematic. Again, it will depend on a person's specific background and specific circumstances to say whether it's really going to result in a refusal or not. So yeah, difficult to say specifically whether or not it would work in your particular circumstances. The risk of having both the PR and the study permit specifically filed at the same time is that there's the potential of the study permit being refused because they're looking at your PR and saying, well, you really do want to come here and stay permanently. And yes, we do have dual intent provisions, but with that being said, it can potentially lead to your refusal. The second question, I believe, was about working while you're studying. And that's a very important point because yes, your study permit, I mean, we talked about this in our last session, the study permit does provide you with the ability to work on and off campus potentially, right? Depending on your program and your status as a student. And it's really important to be thinking about that because you may be able to get your permanent residence through, you want to think about the different ways to get your permanent residence, right? So today we talked about many different programs, right? We looked at the skilled worker, we looked at Canadian experience class, we talked about the provincial programs. And it may be that you're qualifying for your permanent residence while you're doing your studies, right? So what I mean by that is, for example, take the federal skilled worker program. The federal skilled worker program says that you need to have at least 1 year of continuous high skilled work experience in a single occupation within the past 10 years. But it doesn't specifically exclude students, right? We saw that students are excluded from Canadian experience class, right? So Canadian experience class, the work experience requirement, you can't obtain it while you're a full-time student in Canada. But there's no such exclusion in the skilled worker program. So technically, a student could be here studying full-time, getting their work experience, using their study permit, they're working off campus. Yes, their hours are less, so they may have to work a little bit more, but they get that work experience and they're able to qualify for the skilled worker program even before they finish their program of study, right? So we talked about many different options here today, and it's important to think about how they may all play out together, right? The short answer is yes, you can get your work experience while you're studying, right? And, you know, the other part about it, and I'm going off on a bit of a tangent here, but I'll try and keep it short, is that thinking about how to use your family, right? How to think about the family together. So we know from our last session that the student gets a study permit. And if they have a spouse, that spouse gets the open spousal work permit. And so the spouse might be the one, while the student is doing their 4-year program, for example, the spouse might be getting the work experience so that they can all apply for permanent residence together, right? Even before the student finishes their program of study. So really important, think about that family dynamic, think about, you know, how you can use the different programs and leverage them, because there's many different ways to get permanent residence.
Thank you, Zia. I think that was a very detailed answer. The next question is, again, it's an anonymous attendee, but his question is, how do you decide between which is the best option to apply? How do you choose between the normal express entry or the provincial nominee program, or both? How do you take
Yeah,
a call?
good question. It really is dependent on the applicant's background. And so there's no short formula that I can give you to tell you, okay, look at 1, 2, and 3, and that's how you're going to decide. You know, with our clients, it's really important. We sit down with every client, we go through their background, we talk about their goals, we talk about their options, and that's how we really come up with an immigration plan. So for every client, we're sitting down and we're preparing a tailored immigration plan for each individual person. Because like I said, immigration is very personal, right? And so it really does depend on your background, your work experience, your education. And with those specific criteria, we can determine what makes the most sense for every applicant. So there's no short answer to that. There's no magic formula. It is dependent on a person's background. And the best thing you can do is speak with a qualified professional who can go through your background and determine what the best option is.
Sure, thanks. Yeah. Another question is on the Atlantic Immigration Program. This gentleman says, I'm eligible and want to apply for PR through this program, but he wants to understand the meaning of the word intent to stay. What does it mean exactly?
Okay, so there's, that's a great question. And that comes up with both any of the provincial programs or the RNAP or the Atlantic program. You do need to have an intent to live and work in that province. And so really, you know, there's no easy way to define your intent, but it looks at what you've done, right? So if you are applying through one of the provincial programs, or in your example, the RNAP program, but throughout the entire application process, you're applying for and buying a job in a different province, right? That goes to your intent. And so it really goes to show that you don't actually want to live or work in that particular province. You're doing it for the purposes of your permanent residence. And then as soon as you get it, you'll probably leave, right? So intent is really looking at someone's, what that person wants to do and what their steps are to take.
Sure. I know that was a fairly generic question. So
it's a good question. We get it all the time. It's just there's no real definitive or definition I can give you.
Sure. There's another question from Zenobia. What if your job profile requires licensing in Canada? How does that affect express entry? And do you need a job offer for the federal skilled worker stream?
Okay, so I'll answer those in the reverse. No, you don't need a job offer for the federal skilled worker stream. There's no component where it says you need a job offer in Canada. The first question there regarding licensing in Canada, it depends, right? It depends on what program you're applying through. So for example, we'll go back to the previous example of a psychologist. You can have your work experience outside of Canada as a psychologist. Doesn't mean that you're applying for the skilled worker program, you don't have to be registered in Canada as a psychologist as well.
Sure. Another question from Rukshar Gulzar. She's a dental specialist planning to move to Canada. However, her dental degree will be valid only when she clears the NDEB qualifying exams. So under the federal skilled worker program, would her Indian education still be valid?
So for anytime you're trying to use education for the purposes of the skilled worker program, you do need to get what's called an education credential assessment. And so there are specific organizations that IRCC, so Immigration Canada, has approved that provide you with the ECA report. And it's on that ECA report that we determine what the equivalent education is in Canada, right? And it's using that report that we're able to get points in the skilled worker or in express entry or qualify under the skilled worker program using education outside of Canada.
Sure, thanks. Another question, again, it's an anonymous question, but he says his father falls under the high skill category. However, he misses out on the 67 points required for the federal skilled worker program due to his age. So what is then appropriate method for him to apply for a PR?
That's a tough question because I don't know the rest of the father's background, right? So like we said earlier, when we're talking about applying for permanent residence, when we're looking at a person's background, it's really important to consider all of their background and not just their age. Ages definitely can be problematic sometimes, but we want to look at what other circumstances this person would fall under, and then we'd be able to tailor an immigration plan for that. And
Sure.
keep in mind, like today we've talked about some of the more popular programs. We haven't talked about every single PR option available out there, right? There are still routes for self-employed individuals, for entrepreneur routes. There are different ways to apply for permanent residence. We couldn't possibly go through all of them in our session today.
Sure, sure. Thanks. We'll probably take the last couple of questions, and again, I can see a lot of requests for the webinar. So repeating, we'll be sharing the recording of that soon. Um, this question is for an international student, do you have to get your ECA done for your studies done in India, or will the CRS points be considered based on studies done in Canada?
So the CRS points, they look at your education level, right? So it depends on what's most beneficial to you or for your circumstances. And so when we're talking about CRS points, if you've done a master's outside of Canada and that master's is equivalent to a Canadian master's, and when you come to Canada, you're doing a 1-year postgraduate certificate program, you would want to get that CRS. You would want to get that master's evaluated and get your ECA done for it because it'll give you more points. Now, if it's the other way around where you've done a 1-year let's say a 1-year diploma in India, and you're doing your master's in Canada, well, then in that situation, you wouldn't bother getting your ECA because the master's would give you, your Canadian master's would give you more points. So it just depends.
Sure. Again, there are a few questions here, so I'll club them. Essentially, the questions are around PhD. If somebody is doing PhD in Canada, what are the PR options after doing PhD?
So not as easy just to say, okay, based on the PhD, you can apply for permanent residence. Again, we would have to look at the full background to see what the best option is or how you could apply for permanent residence. Some of the provinces do have particular programs for PhD graduates. Ontario, for example, has a stream specifically for someone who has completed their PhD here in Ontario. But yeah, it just depends on where you've studied, where you've studied, if that province has a PhD particular stream. Otherwise, we'd be looking at the general programs that we've talked about earlier.
Sure. And we will take the last question for the day. And I can see a lot of, very specific questions around, this is my experience, this is my background. So at the beginning of the webinar, we shared the link to this help desk where you can share the queries. And we have a team in India as well as our AKEB Canada team is working with us to address those queries. So I know there are a lot of specific queries which perhaps is beyond the scope of this webinar to address, but do drop us a note on that, and we'll definitely get back to you. And the last question of the day, I'll take. This is again, it's an anonymous question, but this is a student who has done a diploma program in Canada. So which of the 3 federal programs is most suitable for such an international student who's done a diploma program?
Again, that's a tough question because it will depend on the rest of their background as well, right? So you may have done a diploma program here, but have you done previous post-secondary education? What are your language proficiency scores? What's your work experience? All of this will factor into what options we have and what the best option is when we're talking about applying for permanent residence.
Sure, great. So again, as I said, a lot of questions still in the Q&A box, but do drop us a note, and we'll definitely try to revert back to you along with the recording of the webinar. And with that, I think we come to the end of this entire series. As Education Board for India, this is the first time we tried out something like this, a series of 4 webinars. And we were not really sure of how it would be accepted, but thanks a lot to all of you audience. I think every time you've attended in large numbers, and there's been a lot of interaction. So extremely thankful to all of you for participating, and we'll be sharing a feedback form as well. So please do share your feedback, share suggestions, criticisms, all of it is most welcome. And once again, a very, very warm thank you to Zia for your time and your insights. I think it's been fabulous, and the insights you shared have been really brilliant. And once again, a big thanks to the AKB Canada team, Nahida and Anushka. Uh, Extremely grateful to you for all the collaboration. And we come to the end of that. So, Zia, any closing thoughts from you before we close down for the day?
No, I think that this has been amazing. I think it's a huge endeavor under both the India and the Canadian team, and I think it's really helpful to have these sessions ahead of time, right, where you're thinking about how to apply, what do I need to know, and how do I reach that end goal? Because, like I said, it is important to be thinking long term right from the beginning. So
Sure. And for the audience here, please do share your feedback and your suggestions. For example, I saw one suggestion on having a webinar for PR options for parents. If your kids are in Canada, so that's a good suggestion. Take in note of that, and hopefully we'll be able to come back to you on something like that. But keep your interaction on. Please join the Telegram group and drop us a note. Keep sharing your feedback. And Yali Madat, and stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for joining.